All right, over to you, Comrade Ian Beddoes.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody from PAWA. Right, I must confess I've had some problems with my internet and with my laptop, so I'm not going to put my face on at the moment. I'm not going to go onto video because we've had problems with that before. So with the lack of power, that's a pun, I'm going to just do this verbally. And first of all, I see we've got more people this time. I want to just recap on what we went through before. If you've read the submissions I've put, we put 3 parts, part 1, part 2A, and part 2B. Part 1 was, what is capitalism? So we explained what is capitalism, and even today on the group, I talked a little bit about what is capitalism. Now, capitalism is not just some abstract thing, it's very real. And one of the things that the capitalists like to tell you is that they're rich because they or their ancestors were careful with their money and they saved, whereas you and your ancestors were not so thrifty and you did not. Well, Karl Marx, way back in 1867, when Capital was produced, he laughed at that. And he pointed out that what we call the primitive accumulation of capital, the building of large sums of money and wealth in order to produce the machinery needed for modern industry, came in a very nasty way. And so in the first document, we talked about how capitalism grew in Britain. Now, it's not just because you guys live in Britain now, or that Britain colonized Zimbabwe. It's also important that Britain was the first industrialized capitalist country. Yes, bits of capitalism had even grown up in ancient Rome, but had not been dominant. Even in Britain, before Britain, in Italy, northern Italy especially, capitalism had begun to grow, but because they were split up into little city-states, Italy only became united as one country in the 1860s. It never really developed properly there. So Britain, and if you know the history of Britain, England was first. England and Scotland only came under the same king in 1603, and then in 1701, I think it was, they came together under a single parliament because you had one king and 2 systems for quite a long time, for 100 years or so. So anyway, capitalism grew up in England very early on, mainly because of Ireland, because you didn't have all the border wars between the different European countries. There weren't proper countries there, different lords. So it was compact, and also it grew up fairly quickly. And because it was surrounded by sea, British people, England, Scotland, the whole of the British Isles, they started going to sea early, which meant that they became traders. And so that's why we're now speaking English today, because the English language spread around the world. We were traders. And then also what happened is that capitalism grew up, first of all, in England. And it wasn't a nice process. I don't want to go through the full history, but basically, industrial capitalism of the Industrial Revolution was able to happen because the people of England, Scotland, Wales were thrown off the land bit by bit. And it was worse than, for instance, in Zimbabwe, where everybody has got their little rural home, even if the whites got the best land. Well, in England, we were left with nothing. I come from a working class family. Neither of my father didn't own his own house, neither did either of my grandfathers. They all lived in council houses. And yet, if you go back some more generations, they had land and the land was taken off them. So that's part of the primitive accumulation of capital. Then when you don't have land, you're no longer a peasant, you're forced to sell your labor power for a wage, not your labor. The capitalist sells your labor. Your labor is part of whatever goods that you make. So the labor of all the people who've worked on those goods is there in the things that are made. The capitalist doesn't make them, the workers make them. The capitalist organizes production. And as we see in modern capitalism, half the time doesn't even organize production because money has become divorced from production. So the capitalist hires managers, technicians to run the production, to organize the production for him while he plays on the stock exchange and buys and sells money. And this is the stage where capitalism has reached today. Now, in order to get all that money, there were a number of things that British capitalism did. And other capitalist countries did similar things, but we're not going to go into the full history of every capitalist country. But what Britain did, Britain became involved in the slave trade, the West Indian slave trade. America had been discovered, at least by Europeans. It was obviously the people who were indigenous knew about it for a long time. But why Columbus was important was not that he discovered America, but because following Columbus, America, North and South, Central America, the Caribbean, was colonized. And when it was colonized, the colonizers needed labor. And what was found, first of all, the indigenous people often, some were enslaved early on, but many of them died from European diseases, which they were not which they died from because they had no resistance to those diseases. Africa being next to Europe, they didn't have those same problems. And what did they do? They took slaves from Africa. And as I've said before, it wasn't simply nasty Europeans coming to take slaves from Africa, capturing the slaves. No, those slaves were captured for the most part by other Africans. Whole African kingdoms made their money, were built up on the slave trade. And those slaves were then taken by the Portuguese were the first slave traders. They took their slaves to Brazil. And then the British were the next biggest. They took their slaves to the Caribbean and to the southern states of the United States. And there they worked on plantations. So the slave trade brought enormous amounts of money in, enormous amounts. And for instance, we all know about Barclays Bank. Barclays Bank built its initial capital on the slave trade in the middle of the 18th century. And those of us who have been in this business for a long time, we often refer to Barclays as the slave bank. And it's not just the slave trade. Those slaves were used for plantations. So the main things, tobacco, which was originally grown by the Native Americans, sugar, which comes from Southeast Asia, and later cotton. So one of the things today, we're always told to that sugar is bad for us. And it is correct. And before the slave trade, people hadn't used to eat sugar in the way that we do. Yes, there was some sweet fruit. Occasionally we taste honey, but sugar in the way that we know it is a result of the slave trade, and it's made people sick. Too much sugar is not good for you, but that's what it is. Tobacco also is not good for you, and that came from slavery because tobacco was grown by the slaves. Now, the other thing that was grown by slave labor was cotton in the southern states of the United States. What used to happen with the cotton? It was picked by slaves in the United States and taken to Lancashire in England. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the state of the workers was terrible. It was not unknown for people to work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week with 1 day off. And child labor was very common. In fact, there was actually, although it wasn't called slavery, there was in fact slavery of orphan children in Britain, because orphan children would be the responsibility of the parish. They wouldn't know what to do with them. So they sold the children to cotton manufacturers. And people started working at the age of 7, sometimes even younger, but 7 was the common age for children to start work. And in the spinning mills of Lancashire, when the cotton thread that was being spun broke, the small child with their small fingers could get underneath and they tie the cotton back together. That was their job. So this thing brought amazing, huge profits, massive profits. And this is what was used to build the industry that made Britain strong as a country, and in the later at the end of the 19th century to become the major colonizer of Africa. France was also a big colonizer, and also, as you know, Portugal and even Germany, although they lost their colonies after the First World War, they all divided Africa between them in 1885, because capitalism had grown right across Europe by 1885. All now wanted to expand, and they wanted to be able to invest in other countries. They wanted raw materials, so they divided. In 1885, they divided Africa between them. And the current borders are in Africa are largely a result of people in Berlin in 1885, the capital of Germany, putting lines on a map and dividing Africa among them. So imperialism is a result of the growth of capitalism. Capitalism is a result of the primitive accumulation of capital by some very violent and very rich people. Now, what I was going to talk about today, and which this document is about, is, you see, imperialism didn't only affect Africa. Imperialism also affected India and China, where there were two ancient civilizations. One of the most ancient civilizations was the Indus Valley, which is now Pakistan, because Pakistan, Bangladesh were all part of India, Indian subcontinent. So the culture of India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, is very similar. And in China too, very ancient. The China is named after the Emperor Qin, who was the first one who's believed to have united China some 3,000–4,000 years ago. So those countries in 1600, China and India had the majority of the world trade, and they were more advanced than Europe. And people don't fully understand that. They were more advanced than Europe. Now, Britain wanted spices, used to trade with India, but the Indians were fighting amongst themselves to some degree, and the British East India Company decided to start moving in, doing deals, and especially they started in Bengal, around now Kolkata, in Bengal, and they spread until they controlled the whole of India. They had a private army there, just as we had in Zimbabwe, had the British South Africa Company, which was a private enterprise, but with the blessing of the crown, but it was a private enterprise. So they took over India. And in India, they found that there was huge amounts of gold, which they plundered. They also found, and this is where it links with what happened with the slavery, they also found a cotton industry. In fact, cotton originally comes from India, and they used to sell their cotton goods. And the British destroyed deliberately the Indian cotton industry so that they could then build up the cotton industry in Lancashire in relation to the slave plantations in the southern states of the United States. And something else they grew in India, and that was opium. And that opium which they grew was sold to China and created huge profits. This was the drug trade. Drug addiction spread in China, and the Chinese government, there was the Emperor of China, tried to stop it. Hong Kong, which you hear so much about and nonsense about democracy and so on, Hong Kong was a port grabbed by the British as an opium port. Took the opium from India, which they grown in India, and it became an opium port. Then when the Chinese emperor says, no, we're not going to take your opium, they fought a war in order to force the Chinese to take British opium. And they fought 2 wars, in fact, which the Chinese resisted. So you hear so much nonsense about China and about India, how they were very poor. They were made poor by British imperialism. Now, China, under its Communist Party, and we know that the Chinese don't always behave well in Africa. I'm not trying to say that they're perfect or anything like that, but from 1949 till now, in 1949, China was a very poor country. It is no longer a very poor country. The age to which people live is going up. They have very good education. They have very modern infrastructure. Their population is now starting, from last year, starting to decline. They're having less children, and they're very prosperous. They had a policy of abolishing poverty, extreme poverty in China a few years ago. And they said there's still 40 million out of 1.4 billion, but 40 million people living in extreme poverty. We have to abolish that. They did it. It took them 4 or 5 years, and they did it. They worked on taking people from unproductive areas, moving them to new flats in town or in other places by improving their traditional agricultural methods. So what they've said they're going to do, they did. And I want to make this point. As communists, it's not about having capitalism one day and then you have a revolution and within a couple of weeks you've got socialism. It doesn't work like that. We have to work on production. We have to work on how where we go from where we are at the time that we take power. So I want people to understand, but China is now the most productive country and is overtaking the USA in many things. And like the USA, you don't, and in Britain, you don't find homeless on the streets of China or Russia for that matter. Most people are working. There's very little unemployment. So these are the benefits of even a basic form of socialism. And that's what we want in Africa and in Britain, the rest of the world. But what I want people to understand is the way that the British ruling class became rich isn't because they saved. It's because of throwing the British working class off the land and forcing them into the factories, which is why they then formed trade unions and fought back. But there's been very many bitter struggles over the years. Two, the slave trade from West Africa gave them huge profits. The rape of India gave them huge profits. And if you read the document, you'll see in more detail what happened. And the opium trade to China brought them in huge profits. Again, like we hear about the drug cartels in South America and so on. The British did it through their government. They were drug traders. So I want to stop there, give people chance to ask questions, but you must know that where the primitive accumulation of capital came, it came through very, very unpleasant means. It meant the death of many people. They were absolutely brutal. It didn't come through a nice liberal democracy. That was something they developed years later. They pretend they'd invented it. They didn't. Even that liberal democracy came as a kind of compromise between the capitalist and the militant working class. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Comrade Bedros. I will stop recording now just because I think some people prefer to ask questions outside the recording. So I'll stop recording.